November is Thanksgiving time, and Thanksgiving is one of those holidays where when it comes to recipes, everybody has their standards that have to be on the table every year. But for some reason, at least in my family, when it comes to the breads and baked goods, they always seem to come from a store or a local bakery. Well, we're flipping the script this year and we're trying 4 new to my family recipes. Our first recipe is cranberry walnut bread. And what's really nice about it is you don't need any special equipment because this is a quick bread, which means that you dump it all together, you stir it all up, you put it in your pan, and you've got bread. So let's get those steps up and running. I have 1 egg in my bowl, and I'm gonna start by just breaking my yolk, just like so. And I'm gonna add all of my other liquids to this. So I have 1/3 of a cup of oil. To that, I'm going to add a 1/2 cup of milk. And this bread gets a little bit of an extra kick by adding 1 cup of juice. So now I'm going to simply stir all of this together so I have a good, nice liquid mixture. And then what I'm going to do is I'm slowly going to start adding in my dry ingredients. The first thing that I'm going to do is add 1/2 of a cup of regular all-purpose flour. Even though we're making bread and you maybe are aware of this, you can buy flour specifically for bread, but we're not going to have to worry about that. We can just keep it simple. We are gonna fancy it up a tiny little bit and we're gonna make some wheat bread today. So I'm gonna add 1 cup of wheat flour as well to help balance that out. It'll also give our bread a deeper texture and color. So now I have my 2 flours added in. I'm going to add 1 cup of wheat bran. So a lot of people might have this in their pantry or in their kitchen cupboard. If you make those protein energy bites that we made a couple episodes ago back in September, you might have a little bit of this left in your cupboard. So this is an easy way to use it up. And we're gonna stir that in now. And we're gonna start to thicken ourselves up as we stir. Or maybe thicken ourselves up by eating this too, I don't know. You do you, man. All right, we're gonna stir, stir, stir. The next thing I'm gonna add is 3/4 of a cup of brown sugar and stir. And when I start stirring that in, it's really gonna start to thicken up and we're gonna get more of that texture of a bread dough. You're never gonna get a fully solid bread dough, but it will start to definitely thicken up. Now at this point, we haven't added any yeast or anything like that, so we do need to add some sort of ingredient that's going to make everything rise. We're going to do that by adding baking powder and baking soda. So we have a teaspoon of the baking powder, 1/2 teaspoon of the baking soda, and the last thing I'm going to add is just a 1/2 teaspoon of salt. I'm going to stir this all together. So basically, if you wanted to right now, you could cook this just like this and you would just have a really nice loaf of wheat bread. But we're gonna flavor it a little more by adding 1 cup of dried cranberries and a 1/2 cup of chopped up walnuts. That's pretty much it. That's all you need to do. The last step is just putting it into your loaf pan. I have this greased already so that it will pop out nicely when we're done. And I'm just gonna pour this in. And now I'm ready to put it in my 350-degree oven. It's going to take a little bit of time to cook this because it is such a dense bread. So it's gonna take anywhere from 50 to 60 minutes, but you'll know that it's ready to pop out when it pulls away from the sides of the pan and you see a little gap in between the metal or your glass and the loaf of bread. Our next recipe is honey oat bread, and this is gonna be another loaf that you could serve at your Thanksgiving table. So we're gonna start with our wet ingredients. So I'm gonna put 1 egg into my mixer. I'm also going to add 1 cup of milk. And my last liquid ingredient that I'm going to add is I have 1/3 of a cup of honey for our honey oat bread. So I'm gonna put this into my mixer. And now I'm just gonna stir to combine all of these. So now I need to have some way to get my bread to rise, and I'm gonna do that with 5 tablespoons of baking powder. So I'm gonna sprinkle that in there. I'm also going to add 1.5 teaspoons of salt. And then I have 3 cups of flour, and I'm going to add this in stages. So this is going to be kind of a theme today with not dumping in all of the flour at once. So I'm going to put about 1/3 of that flour in there, and I'm going to stir this together. And the last thing I'm going to add is 1.5 cups of oats, and these are those quick cooking oats. And now we have the final part of our honey oat bread. And I've got everything mixed together, but the last thing that I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take a rubber scraper and I'm going to combine those final ingredients all together so I start to get the last stages of my dough. And you can see it's a pretty dry dough, but that's okay. It'll push together and make a really nice loaf of bread. If you're worried that it's not going to hold together well enough, you could definitely add more milk to this. And now I'm just going to squeeze it together with my hands to make that last little dough. So I have already prepared just my loaf pan, and I sprayed it with some non-stick spray, and I'm just going to transfer these little clumps of dough into my loaf pan. Whoops, and make a big mess on my table. And then I just simply press it into my pan. And the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a paring knife, and I'm just going to come in and I'm going to cut some diagonals in the top of my bread. And it seems like this is a really silly step, but my last phase of this is to let it sit on my kitchen counter for 30 minutes. I don't have to cover it, I don't have to do anything special, but it's gonna get that baking powder and honey working together so that it will work to really puff this up in the oven. Once this is sat here for half an hour, put it in my 350-degree oven for 30 to 40 minutes, and you will be amazed at how different this looks when it comes out of the oven. We're going to tackle one step a little bit more advanced than our last bread. Our last bread had to rest for 30 minutes. Now this one, we're going for 1 hour. So we're gonna get our yeast starting to activate. In my mixer, I have 1 cup of warm water, and to that, I'm going to add 2 tablespoons of sugar. I wanna give my yeast something to eat while it's in there. And then to that, I'm going to add my 2 teaspoons of dry yeast. So I'm going to drop that in. I have a dough hook attachment in there right now, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this down and just give it one quick little spin around to get my sugar and yeast hanging out together. So I'm going to let this sit for 3 to 5 minutes. I want my yeast to get nice and foamy. While I'm doing that though, I'm going to get my oregano and my parsley ready. So I have fresh herbs here. So I've got my parsley on this side and I have my oregano over here. Now one thing with this is I'm going to start dicing and chopping this all up. I want to make sure that I don't have these stems in here because that's not going to be pleasant to eat at all. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this and I'm going to pull backwards, and then the leaves come right off. And then I don't have to worry about any of this kind of thick woody piece. So I'm going to do this with a couple stems of my oregano. I want to chop so that I have about 2 teaspoons of each of them. Any more than that and it'll be a little bit too much when we're eating. So I'm going to start with that little pile, and I'm just going to mince these up all nice and fine. So now I have my oregano all chopped, so now I'm going to switch over to my parsley. Parsley's a little bit different because it's such a soft herb. I don't have to worry about separating the leaves here. So I'm just going to get a nice little pile. I want some nice leafy greens, and once again I want about 2 teaspoons of this as well. So we're just going to chop all this up. So what I've started doing here is getting the flavoring element ready for my bread, because the flavors are going to go outside of that actual dough. So I have my 2 teaspoons of each. Now these were fresh herbs, and if I would have gone dry, I would have had to scale it back immensely. So what I have in this bowl is 8 tablespoons of melted unsalted butter. To that, I'm going to take care of the salt myself. I have 1.5 teaspoons of salt in here. If you go with salted butter, you have a little bit more intensity in that saltness, and sometimes it can be a little much for the bread. So to it, then I'm just going to add in my chopped herbs, and I'm going to simply whisk this all together. I don't want to add my herbs and my salt right when it's at the most warm after it was melted. I want my butter to drop a little bit closer to room temperature. So now that's good to go, so I can set that to the side and we can start working on making our dough again. So you can see my yeast looks a little bit different now. I almost have a layer of foam across the top of it. So now I'm gonna start adding my other ingredients. The first thing I'm gonna add is 2 more tablespoons of unsalted butter. So I'm just gonna tip those in. I also have a 1.5 teaspoons of salt because I'm working with unsalted butter. And then the last thing I'm gonna add is 1 cup of milk. I'm gonna tip this back into position and I'm gonna stir to mix all this together with that dough hook. My next step is to add my flour, and this time I'm working with bread flour, and I've got 6 cups here. So what I'm gonna do is I'm slowly gonna add this in a little bit at a time. I don't wanna dump it all in because then it's not gonna properly mix. So I'm gonna go with about 1/4 of it and just put that on the top. And I'm gonna do this in 4 small batches until I have my dough started to combine. So I have all of my different pieces in there, but you can see that the dough is still wet. Sometimes if you read a bread recipe, it'll talk about the dough being shaggy, and that's what I have going on here. As you can see that it's coming apart into these little wisps. So what I basically need to do is, now that everything's in there, I just need to turn my mixer on, and I need to keep kneading this until I have one solid big ball of dough. So now that we have our dough mixed and we have that flavoring agent ready, we're gonna start getting into the pull apart stage. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna take little bits of my dough that are about yay big, and then I'm just gonna dip and roll, and you can see it picks up all those little pieces. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna transfer them over into a bundt pan. I have a bundt pan here that's generously greased, and I'm just going to make all these little balls, just like that. They don't have to be really fancy because they're all gonna lay on top of one another. And I'm just going to make a 2 to 3 deep layer of these different dough balls. And actually there's so much dough in here that depending on the size that you roll, you maybe will need 1 bundt pan, you might need 2. It all depends on how big you want this final loaf to be. So we have our dough all rolled and flavored. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take my plastic wrap, I'm gonna put it over the top, and then I'm gonna find a warm spot to put this in my kitchen for about an hour so that it can start to raise. Once it is all beautiful and wonderful, then I will pop it into my oven at 350 degrees. And with this, because every bundt pan has a little different shape, it'll take anywhere from 25 to 35 minutes, but you'll know that it's done if you stick a thermometer into the middle and you're looking for about 200 degrees. So we'll let this rise so we can bake it. So our last recipe is actually pineapple sweet rolls. It's kind of a take on a white dinner roll with a little sweet twist in there, and that comes from that pineapple juice. So we're gonna start right away with that juice. We have a 1/2 cup of pineapple juice. I'm gonna put that into my mixer. Right now, you might be thinking she's been using a dough hook with all of her other breads, and now she's switching to this paddle attachment for her mixer. With this, I have some other ingredients that I wanna mix all together first. So I have 4 tablespoons of unsalted butter that I've melted down, so that's nice and warm. And then I have a 1/2 cup of milk that I've also heated up, so that's a nice warmth too. These 3 things are gonna come together with my packet of yeast. I like this recipe because you don't have to wait for the yeast to activate. All I need to do is give it a quick stir, and that combination of the milk, the butter, the juice, it's already got that yeast up and running, so I don't have to wait for anything extra. My next step is going to be to add 2 eggs, and what I've done is, you can tell they're still separated there. They're lightly mixed together. Because it's gonna go into that stand mixer, I don't have to worry about having them totally combined. So I'm just gonna simply add those in and stir. Now this is the part that can kind of mess with people if you've never cooked with pineapple juice and then added eggs into it. It'll look like the eggs are starting to curdle, but they're actually not. It's okay, it just changes the texture with all of the acid in the juice. So I'm gonna add another sweet element here. I have 6 tablespoons of just regular sugar, so I'm gonna add that to my mixer next. And then on top of that as well, I'm going to add a 1.5 teaspoons of salt. And now I'm gonna mix one more time. The last thing that I have to add is just 4.5 cups of flour. This is just regular flour, just that all-purpose flour, so I don't have to worry about getting a special flour for this recipe. So I'm gonna add this in different chunks. I don't wanna dump it all because we know we'll get the big poof, which sometimes happens anyway. So we're gonna take the steps that we can to make sure that that doesn't happen. So I'm gonna add this in 3 or 4 small batches. Now I've dumped in my first batch. This is when I am gonna finally switch over to my dough hook. So now I'm gonna grab that piece we've been using all episode, put that in there, because now that I have that flour in there, I'm going to see a difference when I start mixing. So we can see that our dough is all combined in here. So I'm just gonna tip it out. And now I simply need to transfer this dough into a greased bowl. Once I do that, I just need to cover it up with some plastic wrap and let it sit in a nice warm spot for 2 hours. And then we can take this big ball of dough and turn it into individual rolls for our Thanksgiving table. So we've let our dough rest for 2 hours, and now we can see that it's doubled in size. It's filling up a lot more of our bowl. And so now we need to get ready for our second rise. So in order to do that, we're gonna finally take that large piece of dough and we're gonna break it down into 15 rolls. You can make this dough, and once you get it rolled into these rolls, you can put it in your refrigerator before the bake, but today we're gonna bake it right away. So let's get this ready into these rolls. So what I have is I have my 9x13 cake pan, and I'm just grabbing a little handful just like this, and I'm gonna fold my dough and tuck under until I start to get that roll shape. So I want this to be a little bit kind of like a golf ball will be perfect, because once we start to get that second rise going, it's gonna get a lot larger. You can see all of those little air pockets are in there from that rise, so we're just gonna gently fold and tuck, gently fold and tuck, and we're going to work to build all of our rolls. And I'm just gonna line them up in my 9x13 pan. So now I have my rolls all laid out in my pan. I've got 15 of them made, and you can see they fit nicely. I wanna leave a gap in there though, because like I said, we're gonna let these rise again. A lot of times when you put an egg wash on a baked good, which is right here in my bowl, I have 1 egg and 2 tablespoons of water, and I'm just kind of mashing it together. Normally what happens is you put this on right before it goes into the oven. You can do that if you want to, but it's going to make these rolls have more of a crustier outer coating. That's what happens normally with that egg wash. I want these to still stay soft. So what I'm gonna do is I'm actually going to put my egg wash on top before I start this second rise, because then what'll happen is I'll get a gentle browning in the oven, and I won't have to worry about it crisping up too much in the oven either. So we're just gonna put this on top of my 15 rolls. So now I have my egg wash on top of all of my rolls, so I'm gonna reuse that piece of plastic wrap. I'm gonna put this on top so I can seal it in, and I'm gonna let this then sit in a nice warm spot in my kitchen for about an hour. Once they have doubled again in size, I don't have to do anything else. I'm gonna peel that plastic wrap off, and then I'm gonna pop it into a 350-degree oven for 30 to 40 minutes. It depends on your oven. So really, that's all we've got left to do with these. So our pineapple sweet rolls have been resting for 1 hour. So I'm going to take my plastic wrap off the top. And you can see that really there's not any space in there at all. And so we're ready to put this into the oven. It's gonna go in there for about 30 minutes. They already got that egg wash, remember. If I were to do it right now, they'd get a lot harder on the outside, and I want them to be nice and soft and flaky when they're in that bread basket on my table. So let's put them in the oven. So we have 4 brand new recipes to add to our traditional Thanksgiving meal. We have our cranberry walnut bread, our pineapple sweet rolls, these delicious pull-apart breads flavored with oregano and parsley, and don't forget about that honey oat bread. All of these things are going to be fantastic additions. You can serve them at room temperature or right from the oven. They're guaranteed to be a success. And don't forget, if any of these look delicious to you, you can find the recipes on my Aprons Optional Facebook page. So remember, the apron's optional, but the flavor isn't.
That'd be cute. Pretzel sticks with like an edible Kleenex.
Edible Kleenex? What kind of world do you live in?
Yeah, that's a good question.